I'm especially pleased now to welcome our closing keynote speaker, a first-time visitor to the WITC stage, but someone who's been well known in Washington for many years, Ambassador Sarah Bianchi, America's Deputy United States Trade Representative, who previously served in the office of Vice President Biden and as Deputy Assistant to President Obama for Economic Policy. Welcome, Sarah, to the WITC stage. Ambassador Bianchi will be joined by another good friend of WITC and friend of many of you, Ambassador Robert Holleyman, the former Deputy United States Trade Representative and currently President and CEO of C&M International, a frequent visitor on the WITC stage. Robert, pleasure to have you on our WITC webinar again. I get you did the conference last year. You hosted a panel on digital trade that we did with guests from Geneva and New Zealand. This year, I think you're in New Mexico, I believe, and Sarah's coming to us from Washington. So real pleasure to have both of you here. Sarah, welcome to the WITC stage.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really great to be here. I know you guys have had a great conference and looking forward to joining you this morning.
Great. Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to all the participants for WITC. It's a pleasure to be with you today, virtually, both in the private sector and in my time in government. I always thought this was a great forum to bring folks together. And I particularly want to thank Ambassador Bianchi for being the guest today and having a discussion before this group, a fantastic group of trade policy experts and people who care about trade and international relations and from all sectors. And so thank you, Ambassador Bianchi, for being part of this. What I'd like to do is, Ambassador and I agreed that we would have a bit of a discussion back and forth and really use this as an opportunity that we can get to know her, know a little bit about her portfolio, understand some of the priorities that she has on her plate at the U.S. Trade Representative's office. So let me, without further ado, let me kick that off and just say, Ambassador, you've now been in office for 4 months, if my count is right. How's it going?
Well, thank you, and thanks for joining here with me. I know you know this perch well, so it's going so far so good. I survived the confirmation process, so that is a feat in of itself these days. And focusing on a lot of different issues, the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Some of these I know we're going to talk more about, but working together with the Commerce Department there, which is the centerpiece of our engagement in economic engagement in the region. Working on China, the bilateral trade relationship there, and ensure that it's fair, and then doing a lot of work in Africa as well, in particular deepening our trade investment relationship with Kenya. So a lot going on over here. So far, so good.
Good. Well, we're thrilled you're there, and thank you for what you're doing and in a very broad portfolio. I know that one of the things that differs a little bit from one USTR to another is the portfolio and responsibilities for each of the deputies. Could you share a little bit, Ambassador, what your current portfolio is? You alluded to that a bit, but kind of help us understand kind of what's on your plate and what's in your area of responsibility.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how different USTRs divide these things up in different ways. But for our administration, I am working on covering basically Asia and Africa in terms of regions. So that's our regional offices that cover the Southeast Asia and Pacific, South and Central Asia, Japan, Korea, and APEC, and then of course China. And then Africa. And then, as you know, USTR, there's kind of a regional divide, and then there's also functional offices. And I oversee USTR's work on small business, market access, and industrial competitiveness, service and investment, and textiles. So that's kind of how it all works out. Of course, there's intersections across along the way, and I work with our other deputy, Jamie White, on a number who I know many of you know. And so there's a lot of cross-cutting issues as well. But that's how we've divided the world.
Good. It's a big world to divide. And thank you for sharing that. And I think it also really gives us a sense of kind of how you're prioritizing the work you're doing. Before we kind of jump into some of the heart of trade questions, just a little bit more about your background, if you could share. I know you've had times previously where you've been both in government, times in the private sector, before you now come back into government in your current role. Can you share any perspectives on either of those, government or private sector, of how that maybe influences how you think about some of these issues as you come back into government at this point in time?
Sure. So I've split my career, as you mentioned, between the public and private sector. In the private sector, worked on Wall Street for a number of years, both at an investment bank, most recently Evercore, as well as at a hedge fund. I also worked at Airbnb, so I got to see a lot of the issues that I know folks focus on. I worked on global policy development there, so got to see a lot of how some of these issues play around the world. And in the public sector, a number of different roles, both in administrations on Capitol Hill, but most recently I was. Before this role, I was then Vice President Biden's head of domestic and economic policy in the White House, working on all of the issues, leading all of his staff work on those issues. I would say, I bring all of that to this role. Certainly bring the perspective of the private sector. I've seen when Ambassador Tai and I were in Japan and Korea and India. I met with some of the private sector companies there, and understood a lot of what they were talking about data protectionism and some of the issues that are at play there, and also. So that certainly informs, some of what our companies face out in the world. In the public sector, I think really. I really have a deep sense of what, Biden is solving for with regard to America's workers. And that obviously plays into worker-centered trade policy and really trying to keep, workers at the forefront of our thinking on everything that we do. So, you always bring all of your past selves to these kind of roles. And certainly that's the case for me.
And as you should, and that's an incredibly rich and diverse background to bring to this. You've sort of touched on worker-centered trade, so maybe I could kind of dive a little bit more into how you think about that. You certainly know the president well. I think that throughout the administration, certainly Ambassador Tai, as you've talked about today, really talk about sort of worker-centered trade. Can you discuss that a little bit more? I mean, I think there's a lot of conversations around what does that mean? What does that not mean? How do we think about it? I'd be curious sort of your thoughts and maybe kind of help the trade community as we think through these issues as well.
Yeah, I think what it means is that workers are front and center on all of the work we do on trade. And I think, I think you saw that in much of the work that we did last year, where we strengthened our global trade relationships and resolving some longstanding trade irritants, creating new tools to engage in the future. But I think in particular, you saw it by the way that we enforced brought some cases for USMCA and using the rapid response mechanism twice to protect the rights of workers in Mexico. I think you saw it in the way that we worked independently and with our allies to combat forced labor and global supply chains. The G7 trade ministers issued the first ever standalone forced labor statement that expresses, our shared desire to work together and with businesses to combat this practice. And then from everything from, ending the 17 year long civil aircraft dispute, suspending tariffs for 5 years and protecting aviation jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think it kind of infuses all of our work, and that will continue into the future as well.
Yeah. So I think the USMCA that's sort of a great example, and a great example of a new trade agreement. And certainly Ambassador Tai had a big role in that, as did Ambassador White and others. So that's a good example of kind of the best, what I guess I would describe as the most modern trade agreement that the U.S. has, that really includes very specific provisions around how to deal with labor. In the countries that you oversee, you've got a mix of countries where we have existing trade agreements, like Korea or Australia, and other countries where we don't have trade agreements, like China or India. So if we're thinking also about worker-centered trade, do you have any sense of how we might, is there much of a difference that we can think of between how we deal with worker issues with countries where we have existing agreements? Might some of those need to be updated, or other countries like India, where we really don't have a free trade agreement at this point in time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we are centering around both. All of our priorities and initiatives. And we think our trade partners have a critical role to play in helping ensure that all trade policy is meaningful results. So certainly it is a more live and vibrant when you're trying to come up with something new and negotiate, like you said, USMCA being sort of a modern day trade agreement with regard to what it can do for our workers. But I think it also behooves us to go back and look at some of what we've done and see where it makes sense to revisit some of the issues. I think it's really driving all the work that we do here. Great,
thank you. Well, one of the issues that I think I've now gone a couple of questions without mentioning China or in detail. So knowing that there are a lot of folks, probably everybody who's participating in this, where China-related trade issues get a huge amount of attention. And kind of as I think about it, and I think as most of us think about it, there are really probably two kind of key ways of thinking about it. One is in the sort of bilateral trade relationship between China and the US and what that means. And then secondly, there's this broader implication of the distortive trade practices that China has that centers around a lot of attention, not just from the US, but many of our trading partners. When I was in your office, we spent a lot of time in the Obama-Biden administration working on China issues, including China trade issues. Big focus. It escalated with the imposition of tariffs during the Trump administration. I'd say the challenges since President Biden has taken office and Vice President Harris have probably even grown since that time. So in thinking specifically about the trade elements, we had a lot of fanfare around a phase one trade agreement with China during the Trump administration. But I think there's a pretty broad consensus, certainly shared by USTR, that the Chinese government did not comply fully with all the expectations of the phase one deal, certainly around the purchases, which some of us would argue purchase agreements are not really trade agreements, but that's another conversation we could have. But what are your thoughts about the current state of U.S.-China trade relations and your role?
Well, thanks for the question. And you're right, we can't get too far into this conversation without talking about China, which is good. I'm really in the thick of this conversation for the administration and with the Chinese. And you're, of course, right that China fell short on its phase one commitments. And we've been actively engaging in discussions, and I have specifically with my counterpart in Beijing on this matter. And so very attuned to this issue. We're trying to create, this is a really important relationship. We're trying to create a stable relationship, but it's also a difficult one. And we're in a difficult stage in the relationship. To be super candid, the conversations are not easy. They're very difficult, but but from my perspective, what's important is we're having conversations, and they will be unflinchingly honest. It is really clear that the Chinese haven't met their commitment in phase one. That's something we're trying to address. But I also want to emphasize it's clear that China's state-centered and non-market policies and practices, which were not addressed in the phase one agreement, are also a serious threat to American economic interests. And we have and will continue to raise these concerns with Beijing as well. And really plan to use the full range of tools we have and develop new tools as needed to defend our interests.
So to the sort of broader elements that you discussed, I mean, there are parts of that the U.S. and you and USTR are doing independently, but there's also work I know that's underway with many of our allies around how to deal with some of these practices. Can you share any perspective on work with our allies to try to address some of these broader trade practices with China that are viewed as not focused solely on the U.S., but that have a ripple effects globally?
Well, it's a great point, and this is not something where we can do this alone. That's a very big priority for the president and for Ambassador Tai, is that we need our partners to engage in all aspects of our trade relationships and in all aspects of our diplomacy. And so we have been working with our allies and partners on strategies to address China's non-market trade practices, to work towards a level playing field and competition. I think the U.S. and the EU certainly have a shared interest in building up our common values to protect mutual competitiveness and technological leadership, and from the challenges, again, posed by the non-market economies, including China. So we've done a number of things to date, and there's more to come. But certainly, there was the technology, the TTC. Council that the president launched with Secretary Blinken and Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tai. That's important. We're having a new trilateral relationship with the EU and Japan. So we're working in all kinds of ways to try and bolster our relationship with allies so that we can work on these issues together.
Great. Thank you for that. And it's I think there are some potential opportunities. I think that's one of the things that the president spoke very strongly about the fact that we can't do all this alone. And I think given the nature of the challenge, it really speaks to the need to work with allies. Well, let me ask you another question about allies, and maybe this is a question then that goes to sort of the heart of your region and some of the reference you made up front to the Indo-Pacific economic framework. I think it's pretty clear that there's not the appetite either by the president or by Congress to revise the TPP at this point or to join the CPTPP. Certainly the administration, and you talked about this earlier at the outset, really speaking a lot and doing a lot of work on the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Based on some of the public statements to date, this will not be a binding trade agreement, but it's a framework for cooperation in certain areas. What else can you share? And what can you share about USTR's role in that process?
Yeah. I think this initiative is actually pretty exciting and will be pretty robust. I think I know there's a lot of questions about it. But I think, look, first of all, the fundamental goal of the framework is, of course, to strengthen our economic ties in the region, improve our connectivity. And the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is the centerpiece of that. But it's going to include, it's co-chaired by us, Ambassador Tai and Secretary Raimondo, and it's going to include, fair and resilient trade, supply chain resilience, infrastructure and decarbonization, and tax and anti-corruption. And we're the lead agency for fair and resilient trade. And I think regarding the trade piece, we are going to be seeking binding commitments with our trading partners, whether it's in digital area, labor, or environment. In the digital, we're going to be looking at a number of issues like addressing data localization, issues like cross-border data flows. We're also in this initiative going to be looking at competition issues. And so I think people, when they really see the details, are going to find that this is, rather robust. It's not going to contain market access commitments, but there are going to be high standard rules to increase interoperability, competitiveness among the parties to the arrangement. So I think we just are a little bit in the early innings here, and that as people learn more, they'll find that there's a fair amount of meat to the approach we're thinking about.
So to drill down into this a little bit, and I realize that there may be limits on how much you can say because it's not been unveiled fully. I think there's been discussions about whether there might be modules as part of this agreement. When all countries join all parts, are there modules? You may still be working on that. Anything you can share about sort of that thinking in the process?
Happy to talk a little bit more about it. You're right. There's going to be modules, although I have to say that my staff teases me because I find that word to sound a little bit more like something that you would talk about at the Container Store than in a trade
Exactly.
deal. But I understand there are going to be modules. I think I mentioned some of them. Fair and resilient trade is certainly one. That's the one we'll be chairing. Supply chain resilience is one. Infrastructure and decarbonization is one, and tax and anti-corruption. All of those will be quote unquote modules. And look, I think they will move at different speeds. There'll be different countries for the trade piece. The way we think about it is that if you're going to be in the trade module per se, you have to be in the whole thing. You can't pick and choose within it. And we're seeking to have a really high standard and inclusive commitments there. Looking at specific provisions on labor, environment, climate, competition, digital, but we're also looking at how we can make rules-based commitments. The United States normally pursues a bit more inclusive. So can we make our customs systems and our customs officials more accessible to groups underrepresented in international trade? Can we find mechanisms that make data centers greener? But also, how do we make overall address competition issues, address data localization, address cross-border flows? So I think within the trade module itself, it will be very high ambition. It may be that not all countries who are joining the overall agreement or joining pieces of this will choose to join the trade one. That's okay. We want to keep it really, again, high ambition, rules-based, and text-based negotiations, that are binding. So that's really the goal.
Great, thank you. I know that there's a lot of interest also in Congress about this, and
sure.
Certainly in where there used to be Trade Promotion Authority, Congress had a keen interest in every aspect of a negotiation. This is not a free trade agreement per se. There's no Trade Promotion Authority, but you've also got a lot of friends and folks in Congress who want to be involved in this. Can you share some thoughts about the role of Congress in part of this process?
Well, the role of Congress is absolutely critical here in terms of close consultation. Ambassador Tai comes from the Hill, and one thing we are, and as does Ambassador White and many people in this building. And so one of the things we are always keeping in mind is how to keep Congress well consulted early and often, and we plan to do that. We don't plan to have market access commitments under the IPEF, so it's a bit more of an administrative arrangement there that includes high standard outcomes and meaningful commitments, but it will be developed with extensive consultation among our trading partners, with our stakeholders, and I can assure you, including close consultation with the Congress.
Is there anything you can share about thoughts around any enforcement mechanism around trade? Certainly a traditional trade agreement would have an enforcement mechanism. Anything that you can share at this still early stage about how you may be thinking about potential enforcement mechanisms for this?
I think we're still in the early stages there, to be honest. So I'll probably leave it at that.
Okay. We'll have you back when
Fair
this
enough.
is all unveiled and to
Fair
dive
enough.
into more of those. A lot of interest in this. Well, one of the other things that I know you did early in your tenure was that you and Ambassador Tai went to India for the reinstituted Trade Policy Forum. Was personally delighted that you all reinstituted that, and certainly, I think the importance of the engagement between the U.S. and India on trade issues is can't be understated, overstated. And so there was a recent announcement from Department of Agriculture around pork products. Any thoughts overall, maybe around the U.S.-India trade relationship, or signs of progress? Thoughts about next steps in your work?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Ambassador Tai and I were in India, and reinvigorating the Trade Policy Forum there was a big priority. And we were actually quite pleased with how the discussions went in Delhi. While a long list of trade concerns remain, it was encouraging that we were able to resolve, a set of longstanding priorities such as pork, like you mentioned. And just as importantly, Ambassador Tai and Minister Goyal agreed to relaunch the TPF working groups and engage on a number of cross-cutting emerging trade issues as well. And so what that means is our teams will be engaging and prioritizing resolution of market access issues, but also means like deepening our dialogue in other areas, including digital trade issues, good regulatory practices, technical barriers. So as the TPF working groups begin to reengage, we're hopeful that we're moving to a really productive period here.
Do you envision that there may be elements at some point of the Indo-Pacific economic framework that could? Yes.
India? I think in terms of India's participation in IPEF, we're balancing the desire to be inclusive with the need for high ambition and expeditious outcomes. But we recognize the importance of being open to a range of economies in the region. So we'll see. India may or may not be willing to engage on a number of the IPEF priorities, but they're certainly an important player in the region. And we also expect to use the Trade Policy Forum to engage in raise many of the issues directly with India. So regardless of what form, we're going to be having an active and in-depth dialogue.
Good. Well, it's a challenge working with India on many trade issues historically, and you will see that as many of your colleagues over the years have seen, but such an important relationship for the U.S. to be working on.
Absolutely.
So many areas, including, I think, in digital, where there should be more commonalities, and hopefully we'll be
absolutely. No, as I mentioned, I met with some of our companies in India, and they have there's some real opportunity for progress for sure. Good.
Well, let me ask you one of the other areas you mentioned in your sort of portfolio of issues, which I'm very intrigued by, and I'd love to hear more about it, is industrial competitiveness. I mean, that's probably at the forefront of so much of what is on the minds of policymakers, on people here in the discussion. We don't as often get to hear a USTR, Deputy USTR, sort of talk about her role on those issues. Maybe share some more about what you're doing, how you're thinking about that, how that fits into the interagency, super important issue for the country. Yeah,
no, you're right. It is. And industrial competitiveness generally is a really important priority for the Biden-Harris administration. Right now, a lot of that is focused on supply chains and supply chain. The president has a sort of a whole of government effort on a range of issues there that have left the U.S. businesses and economy vulnerable to disruptions like we saw in the COVID pandemic. So the programs and investments that have been proposed, in addition to what steps the administration has taken, will enhance competitiveness by diversifying the supply chains and reducing dependence on single sources, training a 21st century workforce, et cetera. And we're constantly looking for how we can use trade policy to complement those efforts. We're also actively engaged with our trading partners to reduce barriers to U.S. exports, and a full agenda with bilateral discussions on some of our TIFA agreements, plans for new initiatives such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and issues in like trade facilitation, custom procedures, good regulatory practices, is all of those things. And then finally, we are also focused on trade enforcement agenda to counter some of the unfair trade practices that are harming United States producers, which include not only challenges from the China industrial policies, but also ensuring that the World Trade Organization is adequately equipped to address non-market practices that undermine global trade and affect, industrial competitiveness. So we have a full and robust agenda there, and that's part of the overall administration strategy.
Do you have any? I know Congress is also playing a role on many of these
Sure.
issues, not specific to trade necessarily, but do you want to offer any thoughts about what Congress is considering about the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act on the Hill, or administration thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, we're working closely with Congress on that legislation to achieve goals. We're in the throes of the different pieces of the legislation and what's in the House and the Senate and all of those things. But I think on balance, the main point is that we're committed to, revitalizing manufacturing, ensuring resilient supply chains, competitiveness of the economy. All of these things are underlying goals that we share with the Congress, and really look forward to working together on those issues.
You also mentioned, Ambassador, at the outset, in your portfolio, you have Africa, and I think you mentioned Kenya, and I know there had been some discussions about a possible free trade agreement with Kenya. A lot of ground to cover around Africa, and a limited amount of time today, but maybe share some thoughts about how you're looking at trade with countries in that continent, how you may be thinking about Kenya, others eager to hear more.
Great. Well, we are seeking, you're right, to grow our investment, trade investment with partners on the African continent, in a way that delivers equitable, inclusive prosperity to all countries and their workers. Ambassador Tai hosted the AGOA virtual ministerial in October to exchange perspectives with her counterparts on that vision, and met in person in December with the Secretary General of Africa Continental Free Trade Area to discuss how we can support their regional integration. We have been doing a lot of robust engagement with Kenya. We're exploring ways to deepen our trade and investment relationship there with the goal of promoting investment and equitable development and sustainable trade. So at the same time, we want to be, supportive of Kenya and its Africa partners' regional economic integration objectives in the African Continental Free Trade Area. So you'll have more to say on Kenya in the coming weeks, but we do want to keep a really deep engagement going. We've met a number of times with the Kenyans, and that's something I think we'll have some news to share in the coming weeks.
Great, thank you. We will be eager to invite you back to pursue.
I know we have a lot more
to
talk about.
we do. Well, listen, before I invite Ken Levinson to come back in, and we've got some questions that I know that are coming in from the participants. Is there anything I've missed? Anything in this sort of broad work around trade or work you're doing that you'd like to discuss a little bit before we open it up for questions from the group?
No, you've done quite a comprehensive twirl through a lot of issues very fast. So thank you for that. But no, mostly I just wanted to say, that WITA does such a good job of really bringing together so many of our stakeholders, and this really is a much broader effort than anything we can do at USTR. It really is about so many stakeholders in Washington and around the country and around the world, that make this thing go. And so just grateful to you all for having me.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Ken, welcome back to the conversation.
Appreciate the kind introduction, Sarah. Thank you very much. We're trying to stay abreast of everything that you are working on and your colleagues. Try to get ahead of a few things that we've been trying to do on trade and the environment in our series on trade and the environment and worker-centered trade as well. So trying to help bring together as many ideas as we can from different parts of the U.S. policy spectrum, the economy, from our global trading partners, and our people who watch our events around the United States and around the world. So we have several questions that have come in. I'm going to jump around a little bit because they hit on a bunch of the different topics that we've hit today. Sometimes I try to bunch them together, but one I'm going to read off of Dan Pearson, who is a former chair of the International Trade Commission and has written a lot about tariffs. He has a view that they have been probably hurting the U.S. as much as they've been harming China, or maybe more so in some cases. What are some of the reasons, that we have for keeping those tariffs still in place today? And is that something that's holding back the U.S. economy currently?
Well, I think the way that you have to think about the China relationship is as a holistic economic relationship. And the way that we've thought about it is to really start with looking at the phase one agreement across the board, and particularly around the purchase commitments. Where, as we discussed, China isn't kind of keeping its commitments. We did, as part of that announcement, agree to open an exclusions process that put in place a process to have some tariff reductions where it's appropriate, and those are kinds of things that we've looked at and could look at in the future. But I think right now the U.S. economy has a lot going for it, and it's our job to really make sure that we take this holistic approach with China and make sure that we're addressing, all of the different concerns, including some of the non-market economic concerns. So that's kind of the path we'll continue to go down.
And so, you've talked about some of the competitiveness issues, USICA, and your close work with the Congress on that, and all the very many people on your team who've come from the Hill and have so many of those relationships with the Hill. And you're spending a lot of time on China. And what are some of the other levers? Do we have other levers in play that we can be utilizing to get them to meet some of the commitments they've made and maybe haven't been able, as Robert called them, purchase agreements? But are there other levers that we can be deploying that we haven't even started using yet, or turning up the heat? Or is there any effort to turn up the heat and try to get them to meet some of those commitments?
Well, it's not our goal to escalate here, but certainly we're looking at all of the tools that we have in our toolbox to make sure they're held accountable. The phase one agreement that the prior administration negotiated, has limits in that regard. But we're going to look at all the tools that we have, and both on the phase one commitments, and then also, as I mentioned, some of the other concerns that we have about the non-market economic practices that are really these are unfair economic practices that are hurting our businesses. So we're going to look everything available to us.
And while not strictly, it has nothing to do with the phase one agreement, but maybe, sticking with the China issue a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the nexus of human rights and trade and the views of USTR in this administration? Obviously, the issues in Xinjiang and with Uyghur, the Uyghur
Sure.
issues are ones that have been front and center, but maybe just talk a little bit more about the values that you all have and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of human rights concerns that have been raised by this administration that have been put forward front and center. And, that's part of the overall China relationship. Much of that, we work with and is managed by, our counterparts at the National Security Council, the State Department, other parts of the administration. But it's a really important priority. And, it certainly plays into the work that we're doing. And I think the president has made very clear how important this is to him. And so anyways, that's, I guess, what I would say about that. But that's something we work as a whole of government across many different, parts of the government to address.
And thank you for saying that whole of government. I was going to, that was related to some of our questions. We had a panel yesterday on China, where we brought in people to talk about the larger strategic relationship with China. It's obviously so much more than just a trading relationship. And there's so many other issues. And that's something that at WITC we try to keep front and center, is to understand the full context of the U.S. China relationship. Related to that, we have actually 3 questions that have come in about the Indo-Pacific framework. So there's obviously a lot of interest. Starting with, one of the basics you mentioned about working with stakeholders and consulting with the Hill. One question comes in is, what are our partnership points for U.S. business and companies that they can be helpful in having their voice heard and also helping advance this agenda?
Well, that's a great question, because we certainly need the help, and we are always an open door. We have a lot of places, ways to talk to us at USTR, and delighted to have those conversations. I think also we can use some help once we get going here with our trading partners. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about having the United States really back engaged heavily in the region, but knowing that the important from the business community and others really will help us secure some of these agreements. And, we're not offering all the traditional market access tools that we have in the past. And so, but I think there's a lot of advantage, whether it's in the digital space or whether it's in competitiveness. There's a lot of advantage for American industry to play a big role here, and we look forward to working with everybody on it.
So that's great. I'm sure that a lot of folks are happy to hear about that. Is there one of the questions that came in too is, as you're pursuing these engagements, are there any related efforts on climate change that'll be part of this initiative, related to decarbonization and other strategies that might be part of the Indo-Pacific framework? Again, thinking of the whole of government, but also the whole trade agenda, and clearly trade and the environment is something that has escalated in importance for the administration.
Yeah, I mean, infrastructure and decarbonization is a whole module, if you will, on it that will be run by Commerce. So I'll leave it to them to share more details. But and then within the trade module, there is a whole section on environment and climate, and that has a lot of different components. So we plan to make this a very big part of the overall effort.
Great. And another question that's come in has to do with how are we engaging with developing economies in the region? What flexibilities might be included in this to have them engaged in the Indo-Pacific framework?
Well, we are going to reach out to some developing economies, and I think there's definitely an important role that they can play. That doesn't mean that they may not want to be engaged in every part of it. And we're going to keep some of it high ambition, but certainly we'll be having a dialogue with a range of our trading partners and of all types. And so that's definitely something that we plan to be engaging with.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate that. I'm doing a final call to our audience. If you have questions, you need to put them in. We've gone through all the ones that have been submitted. I'm not going to keep everybody extra time if there aren't more audience questions coming in. We are really grateful to you, Sarah. Robert, I know you're still online. There you are. Do you have any follow-up questions for Sarah before we wrap up our time here at the conference?
Yeah, I do. This is an Indo-Pacific economic framework, to pick this back up. When do you think that more details around that or announcements may be made?
We're definitely in the weeks, not months.
Okay. All right. Good.
Praise framework. We're working really hard. It's a lot of coordination. It's a lot of work, but we're really excited about it. And so I think you'll begin to hear more from us in the coming weeks.
That's great. There'll be a lot of interest in it.
And, I have no doubt, and we're excited about it and excited to share more as soon as we can.
That's, by the way, take this as an open invitation for Ambassador Tai to come to WITA. We will happy to host her for any announcements she wants to make about.
There you go.
I will
definitely let her know. I know she would love. I know she would love to come, and I know she would love to join you guys at some point.
She's been on our stage a few times with our congressional trade agenda, which I will mention momentarily. Any other thoughts or questions, Robert, before we wrap up today?
I just want to thank the ambassador, and thank you, Sarah, for being part of this conversation.
Of course.
I look forward to many of these in the future. You're always welcome at WITA, and thanks for doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks for all the great, thoughtful questions that you guys all asked.
Really grateful to you, Sarah. Folks who've asked questions throughout the day in the conference, we are forwarding all those to our panelists so they will be able to see the questions that were asked and who's asked them for any potential follow-up. With that, we are going to wrap up everything. Sarah, Ambassador Bianchi, Ambassador Holleyman, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. For all our participants at the conference, really grateful to have had you there.